Hey there! Tonight, we're stepping into a world of myths and misunderstandings. Those stories about the past that sound so strange they must be true, except they're not. Not quite, anyway. We're talking about children sipping ale at sunrise, people who supposedly feared water like it might burn them, and homeowners who literally bricked up their own windows to avoid attacks so absurd it sounds like fiction. These are the tales that get repeated at dinner parties, the ones that make the past seem impossibly dirty, impossibly drunk, and impossibly dim. But the truth, as it often does, sits somewhere more interesting than the legend, more complex, more human. Tonight, we'll walk through medieval villages where clean water flowed from wells and fountains. We'll peek into bathhouses where people soaked and scrubbed with surprising regularity. And we'll stand on Georgian streets watching homeowners seal their windows against daylight itself. Not out of superstition, but out of something far more practical and far more frustrating. If this kind of slow unraveling of history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's oddly comforting to know who else is out there, drifting off to the gentle rhythm of debunked myths and quiet truths. So settle in, dim the lights if you can, let your breathing slow, and let's begin with breakfast. Because nothing says medieval morning quite like the image of a child drinking beer before the sun has fully risen. The beer breakfast myth, the story goes like this. In medieval Europe, water was so contaminated, so thick with filth and disease, that nobody drank it. Not the nobles in their castles, not the monks in their monasteries, and certainly not the children in their cottages. Instead, everyone from toddlers to grandmothers drank beer. Weak beer, yes, something called small beer, but beer nonetheless. Morning, noon, and night, with every meal, because the alternative was death by dysentery or worse. It's a compelling image. Medieval Europe as one giant pub, or even the youngest members of society started their day with a tankard instead of a cup of milk or water, where hydration came with a slight buzz and hangovers were just part of growing up. The story has been repeated so often in books and documentaries and casual conversation that it's taken on the weight of historical fact. People nod knowingly when they hear it. Of course they drank beer, they say. The water was terrible. Except it wasn't. Not always, not everywhere. And the idea that medieval people avoided water entirely is one of those myths that sounds plausible until you start looking at the evidence. And the evidence, frustratingly for the story's drama, suggests something far less colorful but far more sensible. Medieval people drank water. A lot of it. They just weren't stupid about which water they drank. Let's start with the infrastructure. Medieval settlements, whether small villages or bustling cities, were almost always built near sources of fresh water. Rivers, streams, springs, lakes. This wasn't accidental. Water was essential, not just for drinking, but for cooking, washing, watering animals, and running mills. A settlement without accessible water was a settlement that didn't last long. And medieval people, who had inherited centuries of knowledge about water management from the Romans and earlier civilizations, understood this perfectly well. In larger towns and cities, water systems were surprisingly sophisticated. London, for example, began constructing a system of pipes in 1236, designed to carry fresh water from a spring outside the city to a central cistern, from which it could be distributed to various fountains and taps throughout the urban area. This wasn't unique. Many European cities had similar systems, using gravity, lead or wooden pipes, and carefully maintained channels to bring clean water to their residents. Were these systems perfect? No. Did they sometimes break down or become contaminated? Absolutely. But they existed and they were used. Wells were another common source. Dig deep enough, and you reach groundwater that's filtered through layers of rock and soil, emerging clear and cold. Medieval communities protected their wells carefully, often with laws against dumping waste nearby or allowing animals to foul the water source. Guilds of craftsmen who used water, like tanners or dyers, faced heavy fines if they polluted the town's drinking supply. People knew the difference between good water and bad water. They could see it, smell it, taste it, and they avoided the bad stuff. Historical records make this clear. Gregory of Tours, a 6th century historian, mentions people drinking water multiple times in his writings. He describes a devout boy who primarily drank water as part of his religious discipline, suggesting that water drinking was common enough that abstaining from other beverages was noteworthy. He also recounts a traveler asking a villager for water, which the villager provides without hesitation. If water had been considered dangerous or undrinkable, this casual exchange wouldn't make sense. Medical texts from the period also reference water. A 14th century monk listed water as a beverage he preferred over beer. Medieval physicians wrote about the qualities of different waters, distinguishing between spring water, river water, and rainwater, and offering advice on which was best for various purposes. This suggests not just that people drank water, but that they thought carefully about it, evaluating its quality and suitability. So if water was available and commonly consumed, where does the beer breakfast myth come from? The answer lies in a misunderstanding of what beer, particularly small beer, actually was and what role it played in medieval life. Small beer, sometimes called small ale or table beer, was a real thing. It was a fermented drink made from malted grains, usually barley, with a very low alcohol content, typically between 0.5 and 2.8%. For context, modern beers usually range from 4 to 6% alcohol, with some craft varieties going much higher. Small beer was weak. Drinking it wouldn't get you drunk unless you consumed truly heroic quantities. It was more like drinking liquid bread than drinking what we'd recognize as beer today. And that's an important point. Small beer wasn't valued primarily for its alcohol. It was valued for its nutrition. The brewing process involved boiling water, adding malted grain, and allowing yeast to ferment the mixture. This created a drink that contained carbohydrates, trace amounts of vitamins, particularly B vitamins from the yeast, and minerals from the grain. It was, essentially, a calorie-dense beverage. For people doing hard physical labor, which included most of the population, those calories mattered. A laborer working in the fields all day could drink small beer and gain not just hydration, but energy. It was a nutritious supplement, a way to stretch limited food resources and keep workers functioning. The boiling process also had an unintended benefit. Boiling water kills bacteria, and while medieval people didn't understand germ theory, it's possible they may have noticed over generations that beer made from boiled water seemed safer than water drawn from questionable sources. But this didn't make beer a replacement for water. It made it an alternative, and often a more expensive one. Beer required grain, which was also needed for bread. It required labor to brew and time to ferment. For most people, most of the time, water was the easier, cheaper, and perfectly adequate choice. Small beer was consumed by all ages, including children. This part of the myth is true, but the context matters. Children weren't drinking beer because water was unavailable. They drank small beer because it was nutritious, because it was available in households that brewed it regularly, and because in some cases, particularly in urban areas where well water might be less reliable, it was a safer alternative to water of uncertain quality. But they also drank water, milk when available, and herbal infusions made by steeping plants in boiled water. The idea that children specifically drank beer for breakfast comes partly from records of monastic and aristocratic households, where meals were more formally documented. Monasteries, for example, often provided small beer to their residents, including younger members of the community, as part of their daily rations. This wasn't because the monks thought water was deadly. It was because beer was part of their diet, a source of calories and comfort in a life of relative austerity. In wealthy households, serving beer at breakfast demonstrated hospitality and abundance. It was a mark of status, not necessity. Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, recounting his time working in a London printing house in 1725, observed that his English co-workers consumed beer throughout the day, including what he called their muddling breakfast of beer and bread and cheese. Franklin himself drank only water and convinced many of his colleagues to switch from beer to hot water gruel for breakfast, which he found more comfortable and kept their heads clearer. His account shows that beer with breakfast was indeed practiced in early 18th century England, though it also makes clear that water was a perfectly viable alternative, which Franklin himself preferred and thrived on. So why does the myth persist? Partly because it's dramatic. The image of medieval children stumbling through their chores in a perpetual state of mild intoxication makes for a good story. It reinforces the idea that the past was fundamentally different, stranger, less civilized than our own time. It allows us to feel superior, to marvel at how far we've come. But it also obscures a more interesting truth, that medieval people were neither ignorant nor reckless. They made choices based on the resources available to them, the knowledge they possessed, and the realities of their lives. They drank beer when it made sense to drink beer, and they drank water when water was the better option. Another reason the myth endures is because of later periods. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as European cities grew larger and more crowded, water quality did decline in some areas. Overcrowding, inadequate sewage systems, and industrial pollution made urban water sources less reliable. During these periods, beer and ale became more important as safe beverages. But this was the early modern period, not the Middle Ages. The two eras get conflated in popular imagination, and the conditions of one get projected backward onto the other. There's also the matter of the Pilgrims. When the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620, the settlers were running low on supplies, including beer. Some accounts suggest that the decision to settle at Plymouth rather than continue searching for a better location was influenced by the shortage of beer. This has been interpreted as evidence that beer was essential for survival, that without it, the settlers couldn't function. But again, this was the 17th century, not the medieval period, and it reflects the specific circumstances of a transatlantic voyage where stored water had become stale or contaminated. It doesn't mean that everyone, everywhere, all the time, avoided water in favor of beer. The truth is that medieval people had a varied and sensible approach to beverages. They drank water when it was clean and readily available. They drank beer, wine, cider, mead, milk, and herbal teas depending on what was accessible, what they could afford, and what suited the occasion. They weren't living in a constant state of fermented haze, and their children weren't stumbling to school after a breakfast ale. They were practical, resourceful, and far more attuned to the quality of their water sources than we often give them credit for. The boiling of water for tea and infusions was common, particularly in monasteries and among those who could afford herbs and sweeteners. Honey might be added to hot water, creating a simple drink that was both pleasant and safe. Chamomile, mint, and other herbs were steeped to make soothing beverages. These drinks served many of the same purposes as small beer, providing warmth, flavor, and a degree of safety, but without the alcohol or the expense of grain. The process of brewing small beer itself tells us something about medieval resourcefulness. It wasn't complex, but it required knowledge and care. Barley or other grains would be malted, a process of soaking and drying that converted starches into sugars. The malted grain was then crushed and mixed with hot water in a large vessel where the sugars dissolved. This sweet liquid, called wort, was drained off and boiled, often with herbs for flavoring before hops became common. After cooling, yeast was added and fermentation began. Within a few days, you had small beer. But here's where it gets interesting. The same mash could be used multiple times. After the first strong beer was made from the wort, more hot water could be poured over the spent grains to extract remaining sugars. This second or even third running produced weaker and weaker beer, with the final batches becoming the small beer consumed daily. It was economical, using every bit of grain. And it meant households could produce both strong beer for special occasions and weak beer for everyday drinking from the same batch. This process was typically done by women. Brewing was considered women's work in most medieval households, along with baking bread and preparing meals. The brewster, as she was called, held an important position in the household economy. She controlled the production of a valuable commodity, one that could be sold or traded as well as consumed at home. In larger establishments like manor houses or monasteries, brewing might be overseen by a male brewer with assistants, but the principle remained the same. The quality of small beer varied widely. Freshly brewed, it was pleasant enough, with a slightly sour, bready flavor. As it aged, it could turn increasingly sour or even spoil completely, developing off flavors and becoming undrinkable. This is why brewing was done frequently, in small batches, and why fresh beer was valued. You couldn't store small beer for months. It was meant to be consumed within days or weeks at most. Regional variations also existed. In England and Northern Europe, barley and oats were the primary grains used for brewing. In warmer climates, wheat might be used, though it was often too valuable to spare for beer when it could make better bread. The herbs added for flavoring varied by region and season. Before the widespread adoption of hops in the 15th and 16th centuries, brewers used mixtures called brut, which might include bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, or other aromatic plants. These added flavor, helped preserve the beer slightly, and sometimes had mild stimulant or sedative effects. The introduction of hops changed brewing significantly. Hops not only added a bitter balancing flavor, but also acted as a preservative, allowing beer to last longer without spoiling. This made brewing more efficient and enabled the beer trade to expand. But even with hops, small beer remained small, weak, and meant for quick consumption. Milk was another option, though it came with its own challenges. Without refrigeration, milk spoiled quickly, especially in warmer climates. It was often consumed fresh, straight from the animal, or processed into cheese, butter, or curds, which lasted longer. For young children, milk was a primary source of nutrition when available, and there's no historical evidence that it was considered dangerous or avoided in favor of beer. Mothers nursed their infants, of course, but once children were weaned, they might drink cow's milk, goat's milk, or sheep's milk depending on what animals the family kept or could access. Buttermilk, the liquid left over after churning butter, was also consumed. It was tangy, nutritious, and free once you'd already made butter, so it represented no additional expense. Whey, the watery part of milk separated during cheese making, was given to pigs or sometimes drunk by people, though it was less valued than whole milk or buttermilk. The notion that milk was somehow dangerous in medieval times comes partly from later periods when industrialization and urbanization led to milk being transported long distances and often adulterated or contaminated. In medieval villages, where milk came from animals you knew and was consumed within hours of milking, it was as safe as anything else. The main issue was simply that it didn't keep, so you consumed it quickly or transformed it into something that did. Regional differences also played a role. In wine-producing regions of France, Italy, and Spain, wine was more common than beer, and it too was often diluted with water to make it last longer and reduce its intoxicating effects. In Northern Europe, where grapes didn't grow as readily, beer and ale were more prevalent. But everywhere, water remained the foundation. It was free, it was abundant, and when sourced carefully, it was safe. The practice of diluting wine with water was ancient, inherited from Greek and Roman times. Pure wine was considered barbaric, something only uncivilized peoples drank. Proper wine was mixed with water, sometimes in ratios of 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water. This made the wine last longer, reduced its intoxicating effects, and made it safer to drink if the water quality was uncertain. Children and adults alike consumed this diluted wine in Mediterranean regions, and it was seen as perfectly normal and healthy. This practice shows again that the concern wasn't primarily about water being unsafe, but about making resources stretch and adding flavor and nutrition. Wine, even diluted, provided calories, vitamins from the grapes, and a pleasant taste. It turned plain water into something more enjoyable, and in hot climates, it was refreshing when served cool. In monasteries, the beverage practices were carefully regulated. Monks were generally allowed wine or beer with meals, the type depending on region and availability. But they also drank water, particularly during fasting periods or when performing penance. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed by countless monasteries thereafter, mentions wine and water as standard beverages. It doesn't treat water as dangerous or unusual, only as less festive than wine. Some monasteries became famous for their brewing. Belgian monasteries, in particular, developed traditions of beer making that continue to this day. These monastic breweries produce strong beer for sale and weaker beer for consumption by the monks themselves. The revenue from beer sales helped support the monastery, and the brewing itself was seen as honest labor, part of the Benedictine principle of work and prayer. But even in these brewing monasteries, water remained essential. It was used in the brewing process, of course, but also for drinking, cooking, washing, and liturgical purposes. The holy water used in religious ceremonies was drawn from the same sources as drinking water, blessed and set apart for sacred use. The idea that this water was too dangerous to drink doesn't align with its use in religious ritual. There's also the matter of seasonal variation. In summer, when heat and thirst were greater, people drank more fluids of all kinds. Beer consumption might increase among those who could afford it, providing calories and hydration during harvest season when work was most demanding. But water consumption also increased. People working in the fields didn't carry barrels of beer. They carried water in leather flasks or clay vessels, drinking throughout the day to stay hydrated. In winter, hot beverages became more important. Warm ale or wine, spiced and heated, were comfort drinks consumed by firesides. But hot water, sometimes with honey or herbs, served the same purpose and was more accessible to those with limited means. The practice of heating water for drinking shows that people understood the benefits of hot liquids for warmth and comfort, even if they didn't understand the science of why boiling made water safer. Children's diets varied by age and family circumstance. Infants nursed, receiving all their nutrition from mother's milk, or, if the mother couldn't nurse, from a wet nurse. Weaning typically happened between 1 and 3 years of age, after which children began eating and drinking what adults ate and drank, though in smaller portions and sometimes in modified forms. Bread might be soaked in milk or broth to make it easier to chew. Beer, if given, was the weakest small beer, little more than barley water. As children grew older, their diets increasingly resembled adult diets. But there's no evidence of a universal practice of giving children beer instead of water. It varied by household, region, and what was available. In rural areas with access to clean wells or springs, children drank water. In urban areas where small beer was regularly brewed, they might drink that. In wine regions, children drank diluted wine. The common thread was adaptation to local resources and customs, not a blanket avoidance of water. There's also the question of how we define drinking water. Medieval people didn't necessarily drink water alone, straight from a cup, as we might today. They mixed it with wine, as was common in Mediterranean cultures. They used it to make broths, stews, and porridges. They boiled it for cooking and cleaning. This water consumption didn't always appear in records as drinking, but it was consumption nonetheless. And it kept people hydrated, healthy, and alive. The myth of universal beer drinking also ignores the economics. Beer required resources. Grain had to be grown, harvested, malted, and brewed. This took time, labor, and materials. For poor households, especially in times of scarcity, using grain to make beer rather than bread was a luxury they couldn't afford. Water, on the other hand, was free. A well or stream didn't charge for access. For the vast majority of people, water was the practical choice, and beer was reserved for special occasions, festivals, or when extra calories were needed for particularly demanding work. We also see evidence of water consumption in the laws and regulations of the time. Town councils passed ordinances to protect water sources, to ensure that wells were kept clean, and to punish those who polluted rivers or streams. These laws wouldn't exist if nobody was drinking the water. They reflect a community understanding that clean water mattered, that it was worth protecting, and that it was a shared resource essential to public health. Even the design of medieval homes and buildings reflects the importance of water. Many castles and manor houses had cisterns to collect rainwater, which was considered clean and suitable for drinking. Monasteries often had elaborate systems for channeling water from springs to fountains, where it could be accessed by the monks and used for various purposes, including drinking. These weren't just decorative features. They were functional, essential infrastructure. The myth also ignores the diversity of medieval Europe. A peasant in a rural English village had different resources and habits than a merchant in a bustling Italian city. A monk in a German monastery lived differently than a shepherd in the hills of Scotland. To make sweeping generalizations about what all medieval people drank is to flatten a complex, varied, and deeply human history into a single, inaccurate stereotype. So no, medieval children didn't start their day with a beer because water was undrinkable. They drank what made sense for their circumstances. Sometimes that was small beer, valued for its calories and mild flavor. Sometimes it was milk, fresh from the goat or cow. Sometimes it was water, drawn from a well or stream that their community protected and maintained. And sometimes it was a combination, water mixed with honey or herbs, or beer diluted to stretch supplies. The image of a medieval child clutching a tankard at dawn is charming in its strangeness, but it's not accurate. What's more accurate, and perhaps more interesting, is the image of communities working together to ensure access to clean water, of households making careful choices about limited resources, and of people navigating their world with intelligence, adaptability, and a keen awareness of cause and effect. They didn't understand bacteria, but they understood that some water made you sick and some didn't. They didn't know about fermentation killing pathogens, but they knew that beer, when made properly, was generally safe to drink. They lived with uncertainty, but they weren't helpless or ignorant. And that, in the end, is the real story. Not one of constant inebriation or medieval madness, but one of practical survival, of making do with what was available, and of trusting in knowledge passed down through generations. The beer was there, yes, but so was the water, clean and cold, drawn from the earth and carried home in buckets, poured into cups and drunk without ceremony or fear. The fear of water and swimming. Now let's turn to another persistent myth, the idea that medieval people were terrified of water, that they avoided bathing at all costs, and that the entire period was defined by grime, stench, and an almost religious aversion to cleanliness. This myth is everywhere. It shows up in films where nights are caked in mud, in jokes about medieval hygiene, and in the popular imagination's vision of the Middle Ages as a time when soap was a foreign concept, and bathing was something done maybe once a year, if that. Like the beer myth, this one contains a grain of truth, twisted and exaggerated into something almost unrecognizable. Yes, there were periods and places where bathing became less common. Yes, some individuals, particularly certain religious ascetics, avoided washing as a form of penance. And yes, the Black Death and other plagues did shift attitudes about water and disease in ways that discouraged some bathing practices. But to claim that medieval people didn't bathe, or that they feared water, is to ignore a vast body of evidence to the contrary. Medieval Europe had a thriving bathing culture. Public bathhouses were common in cities and towns across the continent. Paris alone had over 30 public baths by the 13th century. These weren't small, grim affairs. They were social spaces, places where people gathered not just to wash, but to relax, eat, socialize, and conduct business. They were, in many ways, the medieval equivalent of a spa, a gym, and a community center rolled into one. The bathhouses, or stews as they were sometimes called in England, were often quite elaborate. They offered hot and cold baths, steam rooms, and sometimes even beds where patrons could rest after bathing. Attendants were employed to help with washing, to provide towels and robes, and to serve food and drink. Bathing wasn't a solitary, hurried scrub in a basin. It was an experience, something to be savored and enjoyed. The business of running a bathhouse was substantial. Water had to be heated constantly, requiring fuel and labor. Fresh water needed to be brought in, and used water disposed of. Linens had to be washed. Attendants had to be paid. The bathhouses thrived because people wanted what they offered. Not just cleanliness, but relaxation, social connection, and a break from the hardships of daily life. Some bathhouses became quite fashionable. In larger cities, different establishments catered to different clientele. There were simple, cheap baths for laborers and more luxurious ones for merchants and minor nobility. Some bathhouses had separate areas or separate hours for men and women. Others were mixed, which contributed to their controversial reputation. The social aspect can't be overstated. Bathhouses were where deals were made. Gossip was shared, and relationships, both business and personal, were cultivated. They were warm, comfortable spaces in cities that could be cold and crowded. They offered a respite, a place where, for a small fee, you could feel human again. For people who lived in cramped, shared housing with little privacy or comfort, a visit to the bathhouse was a luxury worth saving for. Food and drink were often served. You might bathe, then eat a simple meal, then bathe again. Some bathhouses had gardens or courtyards where patrons could sit and talk. Others had musicians or entertainers. The experience could last hours, turning a simple act of hygiene into a leisurely social event. Of course, not everyone could afford regular visits to a bathhouse. Fees, though relatively modest, still represented an expense. For the very poor, or for those living in rural areas far from such establishments, bathing meant something simpler: a trip to a river or stream in summer, a basin of heated water in winter. The practice was the same: wash yourself, but the setting and frequency differed based on resources and access. Medieval medical theory, inherited largely from ancient Greek and Roman physicians, placed great emphasis on balance. The body was thought to contain 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant keeping these in balance. Bathing was seen as a way to regulate the humors, to purge excess, to warm or cool the body as needed. This wasn't superstition. It was the best science available, and it led to practical recommendations. Physicians advised bathing at specific times and in specific ways. Spring was considered a good season for bathing, when the body was thought to be naturally in balance. Winter baths should be brief and followed by thorough drying and warming to avoid chilling the body. Summer baths were sometimes discouraged because heat and moisture together could allegedly lead to weakness or illness. These recommendations varied from physician to physician, and people followed them to varying degrees. But they reflect a culture that thought seriously about bathing and its effects. Medical texts also recommended herbal baths for various ailments: rose petals for skin conditions, lavender for relaxation, chamomile for soothing inflammation. These weren't mere folk remedies, though they had roots in folk practice. They were part of formal medical knowledge, taught in universities and practiced by trained physicians. The line between medicine, hygiene, and pleasure was blurrier than we might expect. One particularly detailed text, written by the 14th century physician Mano de Maneri, offers over 50 different bathing regimens tailored to specific circumstances. Pregnant women should bathe in lukewarm water with gentle herbs. The elderly should bathe less frequently, but more carefully. Travelers should bathe upon arriving somewhere new to refresh themselves. Each regimen specified water temperature, duration, additives, and post-bath care. This level of detail suggests that bathing was taken seriously, not feared or avoided. Royal and noble households sometimes had private baths built into their castles or manors. These weren't always full rooms like modern bathrooms. Sometimes they were portable tubs that could be set up in a bedchamber and removed when not in use. But some castles had dedicated bathing rooms, often located near fireplaces or kitchens where water could be heated more easily. Archaeological evidence from castles and manor houses across Europe shows sophisticated plumbing in some cases, with pipes bringing water in and draining it out. Monasteries, too, invested heavily in bathing facilities. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many monastic communities, specified that monks should be provided with opportunities to bathe, though not so frequently that it became a distraction from spiritual duties. Most monasteries had a lavatorium, a room or area with basins where monks washed their hands and faces daily. Some also had separate bathhouses for more thorough washing, used weekly or on special occasions. The very design of monastic complexes shows the importance placed on water. Monasteries were often built near streams or springs, and elaborate channels and pipes directed water throughout the compound. Water was used for drinking, cooking, irrigation, laundries, and bathing. The infrastructure was impressive, sometimes rivaling Roman aqueducts in its sophistication. In everyday life, for ordinary people, bathing rituals were simpler, but still present. A common practice was to wash hands and face upon waking. Water might be kept in a ewer, a kind of pitcher, poured into a basin for washing. This daily routine was expected, basic hygiene that even the poorest practiced. Before meals, especially formal ones, hand washing was mandatory. Etiquette guides stress this repeatedly. Since people ate with their hands, clean hands were essential not just for manners, but for health. Feet, too, received attention. They got dirty, of course, from walking on unpaved streets and floors. Washing feet before bed was common, a practical necessity, and, in Christian tradition, also an act of humility and care modeled on biblical stories of foot washing. Servants might wash their master's feet, or family members might wash each other's. It was mundane and meaningful at once. Hair washing is less documented, but references exist. Wealthy women, in particular, are described in literature having their hair washed and perfumed. This wasn't a daily act. Hair washing was labor-intensive, but it happened regularly enough to be mentioned. Herbs like rosemary, chamomile, or nettle were used as rinses. Some texts recommend washing hair no more than once every few weeks to avoid catching cold. But this reflects medical caution, not indifference to cleanliness. Medieval artwork and literature are filled with references to bathing. Illuminated manuscripts show people lounging in tubs, sometimes eating or drinking while they soak. Poems describe the pleasures of a hot bath after a long journey or a hard day's work. Medical texts recommend regular bathing as part of a healthy regimen, advising on the best times to bathe, the ideal water temperature, and the herbs or oils that might be added for therapeutic effect. One particularly famous medieval text, the Regimen Sanitatis Soonitanum, a health guide written in verse, advises washing the hands and face in cold water every morning and taking care to stay warm after a bath. It doesn't suggest that bathing is dangerous or to be avoided. It treats it as a normal, expected part of life, something to be done with care and attention, but not something to fear. Charlemagne, the great Frankish emperor of the late 8th and early 9th centuries, was recorded by his biographer Einhard as having a fondness for bathing. His palace at Aachen featured extensive thermal baths fed by natural hot springs, and according to Einhard's account, Charlemagne regularly invited his sons, friends, and courtiers to join him. The biographer notes that at times, more than 100 men would bathe together in the palace's large pools. This wasn't seen as strange or excessive in the context of Carolingian court life. It was simply part of royal routine, a way to relax, bond, and maintain cleanliness. For those who couldn't afford or didn't have access to public bathhouses, bathing at home was still common. The typical method involved a wooden tub, often just large enough to sit in, filled with heated water. This water would have been heated over a fire and carried to the tub in buckets. A laborious process that meant full immersion baths were likely a weekly or occasional event rather than a daily one. But daily washing, using a basin and a cloth, was expected. People washed their hands and faces every morning, and often before and after meals, especially since eating with one's hands was the norm, and cutlery was still relatively rare. Medieval etiquette guides, which instructed people on proper behavior, make this clear. They advise washing the hands before sitting down to eat, not spitting on the table, and not wiping one's nose on the tablecloth. These instructions wouldn't exist if people were indifferent to cleanliness. They reflect a society that valued hygiene and expected certain standards of behavior, even if those standards differed from our own. Clothing also played a role in medieval hygiene. Linen undergarments were worn next to the skin and changed regularly, often daily among those who could afford it. Linen absorbed sweat and could be washed relatively easily, unlike wool outer garments, which were heavier and more difficult to clean. The practice of wearing and frequently changing linen undershirts in shifts was essentially a form of bathing, removing dirt and oils from the body, even if a full immersion bath wasn't practical. So where did the idea that medieval people didn't bathe come from? Part of it stems from later periods, particularly the 16th and 17th centuries. During and after the Great Plagues, especially the Black Death of the 14th century, attitudes toward bathing did shift in some places. Physicians of the time, working with the miasma theory, which held that disease spread through bad air or corrupted vapors, began to advise against bathing. The reasoning was that hot water opened the pores of the skin, which they believed could allow poisonous vapors to enter the body more easily. Public bathhouses, where people shared water and sat in close proximity, were seen as particularly risky. Observations during plague outbreaks seemed to support these fears. Bathhouse attendants and frequent bathers appeared to suffer higher mortality rates, though this was likely because communal bathhouses served as gathering places where disease could spread through close contact rather than through the bathing itself. In response, many bathhouses were closed, and bathing became less common among some segments of the population. This shift was particularly pronounced in Northern Europe and among the upper classes, who had the resources to change their habits. But it wasn't universal, and it wasn't permanent. And critically, it was a post-medieval development, reflecting early modern fears rather than medieval practices. The association of bathhouses with immorality also played a role in their decline. Many public baths allowed men and women to bathe together, or had mixed hours, and some doubled as brothels or sites of illicit activity. Church authorities, already suspicious of anything that involved nakedness and bodily pleasure, condemned public bathing as sinful and urged the faithful to avoid it. This moral panic, combined with plague fears, contributed to the closure of many bathhouses by the 16th century. But again, this was later. During the height of the medieval period, roughly the 10th through the 14th centuries, bathing was widely practiced and socially acceptable. The idea that medieval people stank and never washed is a stereotype that emerged later, fueled by early modern anxieties and reinforced by the condescending attitudes of later historians who wanted to emphasize how much more enlightened and clean their own societies were. There were, of course, exceptions. Some medieval saints and mystics, seeking to mortify the flesh and demonstrate their devotion, deliberately avoided bathing. Saint Fintan of Clonana, for example, was said to bathe only once a year, just before Easter, for 24 years. This was held up as evidence of his holiness, his willingness to endure discomfort and filth for the sake of spiritual purity. But these cases were notable precisely because they were unusual. Ordinary people, even ordinary religious people, bathed more frequently. Interestingly, the early English had a somewhat snobbish view of the Vikings, whom they accused of excessive cleanliness. According to Anglo-Saxon writers, the Vikings bathed once a week, usually on Saturdays, which the English found vain and frivolous. This suggests that the English themselves bathed less often, but it also indicates that bathing was common enough to comment on, and that different cultures had different standards. Swimming and water recreation were also part of medieval life, though the documentary evidence is scattered rather than systematic. Some illuminated manuscripts include scenes of people swimming in rivers or ponds, often shown naked, splashing and playing in the water. The famous Book of Hours of the Duc de Berry, a beautifully illuminated manuscript from the early 15th century, includes background scenes and some monthly illustrations that appear to show people bathing and cooling off in ponds. These weren't moral lessons or fantasies. They appear to be depictions of seasonal activities considered normal for the time. Rivers and ponds served multiple purposes. They were sources of water for drinking and cooking, places to wash clothes, and spots to cool off on hot days. Swimming as a skill was less emphasized than it would be in later centuries, partly because drowning was a real risk and partly because most people's lives didn't require them to swim. The people did enter the water, did wash themselves in streams and lakes, and did understand the pleasure and utility of water. There were also medical traditions involving water. Bathing in mineral springs or thermal baths was believed to have healing properties, a belief inherited from the Romans and continued throughout the medieval period. Spa towns, like Bath in England, attracted visitors seeking relief from various ailments. These weren't just folk practices. They were part of the medical mainstream, recommended by physicians and practiced by people of all classes. The idea that medieval people feared water then doesn't hold up. They used water constantly for drinking, cooking, washing, and recreation. They built infrastructure to manage it, laws to protect it, and social spaces centered around it. They understood its value and its dangers, and they approached it with practical intelligence rather than superstitious dread. What they didn't have was our modern understanding of hygiene. They didn't know about germs or bacteria. They didn't understand that boiling water killed microorganisms, or that soap worked by breaking down oils and trapping dirt. But they knew that washing made them feel better, that clean hands were important, and that certain practices like bathing before major festivals or washing before meals were both socially expected and personally beneficial. Class mattered, of course. Wealthy nobles had access to private baths, perfumed soaps, and servants to heat and carry water. Peasants bathed in rivers or used basins in cold water. But even among the poor, cleanliness was valued. Archaeological evidence from medieval households shows the presence of washing basins, combs, and other grooming tools. People cared about their appearance and their hygiene, even if their resources were limited. The decline of bathing culture after the Black Death was a tragedy in many ways. The closure of public bathhouses, the spread of fear around water and communal washing, and the shift toward dry cleaning methods, like changing linen frequently but bathing rarely, had real health consequences. But it also wasn't a return to some earlier medieval norm. It was a new development, a response to specific crises, and one that wouldn't fully reverse until the 18th and 19th centuries with the rise of modern sanitation and the germ theory of disease. Medieval people, in short, were not afraid of water. They bathed, they swam, they valued cleanliness, and they built entire social structures around the practice of washing. The myth that they didn't is just that, a myth. One that says more about our own assumptions and prejudices than it does about the reality of life in the Middle Ages. The window tax. Now we come to something that isn't a myth at all, but is so strange and so seemingly nonsensical that it might as well be. The window tax. A real law, implemented in real places, with real consequences that can still be seen today in the bricked-up windows of old buildings across Britain and beyond. This wasn't medieval. It was later, beginning in 1696 under King William III, but it's too fascinating to leave out. And it connects to the broader theme of historical misunderstandings and the ways people adapted to absurd circumstances. Imagine this. You own a modest house in late 17th century England. It's not grand, but it has a few windows, enough to let in light and air. One day, a government official arrives and informs you that you now owe a tax based on the number of windows in your home. Not on your income, not on the size of your property, but on your windows. The more windows you have, the more you pay. You do the math. You consider your options. And then, if you're like thousands of other homeowners, you pick up a trowel and start bricking up your windows. This actually happened. The window tax was introduced in England and Wales in 1696, ostensibly as a way to raise revenue without resorting to an income tax, which was deeply unpopular at the time. The logic was straightforward. Wealthier people lived in larger houses with more windows, so a tax on windows would function as a progressive tax, placing a greater burden on the rich while sparing the poor. The initial structure was a two-part system. There was a flat rate of 2 shillings per house, which every household had to pay, and an additional variable tax based on the number of windows. Houses with 10 to 20 windows paid 4 shillings extra. Those with more than 20 windows paid 8 shillings extra. The idea was that this would be easy to assess. Tax collectors could simply walk down the street, count windows, and send a bill. But human behavior is rarely so simple. Almost immediately, people began looking for ways to avoid the tax. The easiest method was obvious: reduce the number of windows. Some people bricked up existing windows, sealing them from the inside or outside with brick and mortar. Others, when building new homes, designed them with fewer windows, clustering openings in ways that minimized the count while still providing some light. Still others manipulated the definition of a window, arguing that certain openings, skylights, or vents didn't qualify and shouldn't be taxed. The tax was repeatedly modified over its 155-year existence, each change reflecting attempts by the government to close loopholes and increase revenue. In 1709, following the Union of England and Scotland, taxes were harmonized and a new top rate was introduced for houses with 30 or more windows. In 1747, the structure changed again. Now, houses with 10 to 14 windows were charged 6 pence per window. Those with 15 to 19 paid 9 pence, and those with 20 or more paid a shilling. The threshold kept dropping. In 1766, houses with just 7 windows became taxable. By 1825, it was 8. Each adjustment prompted a new wave of window blocking. The evidence is still visible today. Walk through older neighborhoods in cities like London, Bath, or Edinburgh, and you'll see them. Ghost windows, rectangular outlines in the brick, where windows once existed or were planned but never installed. Some are obvious, crude patches that don't quite match the surrounding wall. Others are more subtle, carefully bricked to blend in or even painted over with false windows. A trompe-l'oeil technique meant to preserve the building's aesthetic symmetry while avoiding the tax. The consequences went beyond aesthetics. Windows provide light and ventilation, both essential for health. Blocking them made homes darker, damper, and stuffier. In crowded urban tenements, where multiple families might live in a single building counted as one dwelling for tax purposes, landlords often bricked up windows to reduce their tax burden. The costs were passed on to tenants through higher rents, and the living conditions deteriorated. The impact on urban poor was particularly severe. Imagine living in a London tenement in the early 1800s. Your building, originally constructed with adequate windows, has had many of them sealed. Your rooms are perpetually dim, even at midday. You light candles when you can afford them, but candles cost money, and the flickering light strains your eyes. The air is stale because the reduced ventilation can't clear the smoke from cooking fires or the accumulated odors of too many people in too small a space. Dampness becomes a constant problem. Without sunlight to dry out walls and without airflow to carry moisture away, mold spreads. Your clothes never quite dry. Your bedding feels perpetually clammy. Respiratory infections circulate endlessly through the building, passing from family to family, and you have no idea that the lack of light and air is making you more susceptible. Children who grew up in these conditions often suffered disproportionately. Without adequate sunlight, which the body uses to produce vitamin D, bone development could be compromised. Rickets, a disease caused by vitamin D deficiency that results in soft, weakened bones, became increasingly common in urban slums during the industrial period. While it's difficult to establish a direct causal link solely to the window tax, the correlation between dark, unventilated housing and childhood bone diseases was noted by physicians of the era. Children with rickets had bowed legs, bones that didn't grow straight, and weakened immune systems. Many died young. Those who survived carried the physical markers of their childhood deprivation for life. Tuberculosis, the white plague as it was sometimes called, thrived in dark, unventilated spaces. The bacteria that caused tuberculosis spread through airborne droplets, and in crowded rooms with poor ventilation, they accumulated. Families living in buildings with bricked-up windows faced higher rates of infection. The disease could linger for years, slowly consuming the victim. It was called consumption for a reason. It seemed to consume the person from within, leaving them pale, thin, and breathless. Medical professionals began to notice. By the mid-19th century, there was growing awareness that lack of light and fresh air contributed to disease, particularly tuberculosis and other respiratory illnesses. Reformers campaigned against the window tax, calling it a tax on light, air, and health. Charles Dickens, ever the social critic, wrote passionately against it, declaring that neither air nor light had been free since the tax's imposition. Dickens wasn't alone. Public health advocates, architects, and social reformers all pointed to the window tax as an example of policy that prioritized revenue over people. They documented the correlation between bricked-up windows and disease rates. They toured slums and took notes. They gave speeches and wrote pamphlets. The evidence was damning, and it was growing harder for the government to ignore. But resistance to repeal was strong. The window tax generated significant revenue, money that funded the military, the royal household, and government operations. Losing that revenue meant finding alternative sources, and no alternative was without controversy. Income tax was still unpopular. Property taxes based on other factors were complicated to assess. So the window tax persisted, year after year, despite the mounting evidence of harm. The economic distortions created by the tax were also significant. Builders designed houses with tax avoidance in mind rather than optimal living conditions. This led to peculiar architectural features. Some houses had large rooms with only 1 or 2 windows, creating dark interiors. Others had windows positioned awkwardly, placed to minimize count rather than maximize light or views. There was also the question of what counted as a window. The law didn't define this clearly, which led to disputes and litigation. Was a skylight a window? What about a vent? A glass door? A small opening in a larder for ventilation? Different tax assessors made different judgments, creating inconsistency and unfairness. Some homeowners were charged for tiny openings that let in barely any light. Others argued successfully that large glazed areas weren't technically windows and escaped taxation. This legal ambiguity created a cottage industry of tax avoidance strategies. Architects and builders developed techniques for creating light without triggering the tax. Skylights, when ruled exempt, became more common. Borrowed light, where interior windows allowed light from a taxed window to illuminate multiple rooms, was used creatively. Some buildings had elaborate systems of mirrors and reflective surfaces to spread light from a minimal number of windows. The window tax also influenced urban planning and development. In some cities, entire neighborhoods were built with minimal fenestration, creating streetscapes that were uniformly dark and oppressive. This wasn't because builders or residents wanted it that way. It was because the economic pressure of the tax made brighter alternatives unaffordable. Wealthy homeowners had options. They could afford to pay the tax and keep their windows, or they could build country estates outside areas where the tax was strictly enforced, or they could use loopholes and legal strategies to minimize their burden. But for the middle and working classes, options were limited. You either paid, or you bricked up windows, or you lived in buildings where your landlord made that decision for you. Regional variations in enforcement and compliance added another layer of complexity. In some areas, assessors were strict, counting every possible opening. In others, they were lenient, turning a blind eye to ambiguous cases or accepting bribes to undercount. This created geographic disparities in both tax burden and living conditions. Scotland's experience with the window tax shows some of these variations. The tax came later to Scotland, introduced in 1748, and was structured slightly differently. The threshold for taxation was 7 windows rather than 10, and exemptions were given for houses with annual rent below £5. This reflected Scotland's different economic conditions and housing stock. Scottish tenements, often built vertically with multiple stories, posed particular challenges for assessment and led to distinctive patterns of window bricking, often concentrated on upper floors where exemptions didn't apply. In Ireland, which also had the window tax, enforcement varied widely. In some areas, particularly in Dublin and other major cities, the tax was strictly applied. In rural areas, it was often ignored or inconsistently enforced. This created a patchwork of compliance and evasion that reflected local power dynamics as much as any consistent policy. France's experience offers another perspective. The French window tax, introduced in 1798 during the Revolutionary period, was part of a broader effort to modernize taxation and increase state revenue. It followed a similar logic to the British version, taxing visible wealth without the controversy of income assessment, and it led to similar behaviors. French buildings from this period also show bricked-up windows, though the aesthetic was sometimes different, with French builders more likely to maintain facade symmetry through decorative false windows. The French tax persisted even longer than the British one, not being repealed until 1926. This meant that French architecture was shaped by the tax for well over a century. Some French urban neighborhoods still bear the marks. Buildings with oddly placed or obviously blocked windows that speak to long-forgotten fiscal pressures. Public pressure mounted in Britain throughout the 1840s. The winter of 1850 to 1851 saw particularly strong agitation for abolition. Critics argued that the tax disproportionately harmed the poor, stifled architectural innovation, and contributed to public health crises in urban slums. Petitions were signed. Editorials were published. Politicians who supported repeal gained popularity, while those who defended the tax faced growing criticism. The case against the tax had become overwhelming. It was regressive in practice, despite its progressive intentions. It caused measurable harm to public health. It distorted the housing market and created perverse incentives. It generated administrative costs that ate into the revenue it raised. And it was deeply unpopular, seen as an unjust intrusion into private life and a literal tax on something as basic as daylight. Finally, on July 24, 1851, under Queen Victoria's reign, the window tax was repealed. It was replaced with a simpler tax on inhabited houses, calculated by rental value rather than window count. The change was celebrated widely. Newspapers ran jubilant headlines. Architects and builders looked forward to designing with more freedom. And gradually, over the following decades, some bricked-up windows were reopened as homeowners took advantage of the newfound freedom. But many remained sealed. The cost and effort of restoration meant that countless windows stayed bricked, becoming permanent features of the buildings. Reopening a window wasn't simple. You had to remove the bricks and mortar, repair the frame if it still existed, or build a new one, source and install glass, and finish the interior and exterior. For poor homeowners, this was prohibitively expensive. For landlords, there was little incentive if tenants were already paying rent based on the property as it was. Today, they serve as historical markers, visible reminders of a policy that seemed reasonable on paper, but created real suffering and absurdity in practice. They're a testament to unintended consequences, to the ways laws shape behavior, and to the stubbornness of people confronted with what they perceive as unjust demands. Walking through cities like Bath, Edinburgh, or Bristol today, you can play a game of spotting ghost windows. Some are obvious rectangular patches of brick or stone that don't match the surrounding wall. Others are subtle, revealed only by changes in color or texture, or by the presence of a lintel or sill with no opening beneath. Some have been painted over, disguised but not erased. A few have been turned into decorative features, with painted flowers or scenes covering the brick. Tour guides point them out as curiosities, bits of historical trivia to enliven a walking tour. But they're more than that. They're reminders that policy has consequences, that government decisions ripple through lives in unexpected ways, and that resistance to unjust laws takes many forms. Breaking up a window was an act of compliance and defiance at once. It followed the letter of the law while protesting its spirit. The window tax also offers a lesson in how we think about taxation and fairness. The idea of taxing wealth indirectly through proxies like windows seems clever. It avoids the intrusiveness of income assessment and uses something visible and countable, but it relies on assumptions that don't always hold. It assumes that window count correlates reliably with wealth, that people won't change their behavior to avoid the tax, and that the social costs of enforcement and evasion are acceptable. In reality, people adapted. They bricked up windows, built with fewer openings, and found ways around the rules. The tax generated revenue, yes, but it also created inefficiency, hardship, and a built environment that was demonstrably worse for health. It's a case study in how even well-intentioned policies can backfire when they ignore human nature and fail to account for broader impacts. Modern economists study the window tax as an example of deadweight loss and behavioral response to taxation. The data shows clear clustering around tax thresholds, evidence of strategic decision-making by homeowners and builders. It demonstrates that people respond to incentives, sometimes in ways that defeat the policy's purpose. The tax aimed to raise revenue from the wealthy, but it ended up making everyone worse off. The wealthy who paid, the poor who lived in darkened buildings, and the society that suffered from increased disease and reduced quality of life. Some modern buildings still include fake bricked-up windows as a design element, a nod to history, or an attempt to create period aesthetics. These are controversial among architects and historians. Some see them as playful references to the past. Others see them as trivializing a history of real suffering. The debate itself shows how the window tax continues to resonate, how it remains part of the visual language of British architecture and urban identity. And perhaps that's the real story of the window tax. Not just a strange historical footnote, but a reminder that law's shape lives in ways both seen and unseen. That people respond to incentives in surprising ways, and that something as simple as a window can become, under the right circumstances, a battleground of power, resistance, and survival. The legacy lives on in other ways too. The phrase tax on light and air, while not as catchy as daylight robbery, accurately captures what the window tax represented. And it's been invoked in modern debates about taxation and public health. When governments propose taxes that might harm health or quality of life, critics often reach for the window tax as a cautionary tale. It's become shorthand for short-sighted policy, for prioritizing revenue over welfare, for ignoring unintended consequences. In the end, the window tax stands as a peculiar monument to human adaptability and governmental folly. It shows us that people confronted with absurd demands will find absurd solutions. That bricks and mortar can be tools of protest as much as construction. And that sometimes the marks we leave on the landscape tell stories more powerful than any written history. So the next time you walk past an old building and notice a bricked-up window, pause for a moment. Think about the family who lived behind that wall, sitting in dimness because light cost too much. Think about the choice they faced: pay the tax or seal the opening. Think about the children who grew up in that shadow, whose bones bent from lack of sun, whose lungs weakened from lack of air. And remember that policy matters, that laws have weight, that good intentions aren't enough if the execution causes harm. The window tax is history, but the lessons it teaches remain painfully relevant. Every time we create a law, we shape behavior. Every time we tax, we change incentives. And every time we forget to ask what happens to real people in real homes, we risk creating new walls, new darkness, new unintended harm. Scotland had its own version of the tax, introduced later in 1748 and structured slightly differently. Houses with fewer than 7 windows, or with an annual rent under £5, were exempt. This created regional variations in how buildings were designed and modified, with Scottish architecture reflecting its own adaptations to the tax. France also implemented a window tax, beginning in 1798 during the Revolutionary period and lasting until 1926. Like in Britain, it led to bricked-up windows and architectural compromises. The tax was part of a broader European pattern of governments trying to raise revenue through property taxes without directly assessing income, which was seen as invasive and politically risky. One of the enduring legends associated with the window tax is the phrase daylight robbery, meaning something that's outrageously unfair or overpriced. The connection seems perfect, a literal robbery of daylight, forcing people to pay for the natural light entering their homes. However, the actual origins of this phrase are disputed among historians. The Oxford English Dictionary's earliest recorded use is from 1916, and some sources place it even earlier. While the window tax may have influenced the phrase's popularity or given it additional resonance, we can't definitively say it originated from the tax. Still, whether or not the phrase came from the window tax, it certainly describes the spirit of what many felt about this legislation. Still, the phrase has become so associated with the tax that it's repeated as fact in countless articles and discussions. It's a reminder that even in debunking myths, new ones can take root, especially when they're emotionally resonant and easy to remember. The window tax also had broader economic effects. It distorted the housing market, discouraging construction of well-lit, well-ventilated buildings in favor of darker, cheaper designs. It created perverse incentives for landlords who could reduce their tax bills by making their properties less livable. And it generated significant administrative costs, requiring assessors to count and record windows across entire regions. Interestingly, data analysis of historical tax records shows clustering around certain window thresholds. Houses with exactly 9, 14, or 20 windows were much rarer than might be expected, because those numbers sat just above tax brackets. People built to stay below the threshold, constructing homes with deliberate gaps or asymmetries to avoid triggering higher rates. Some homeowners got creative. False walls were built to hide windows from the street. Rooms were subdivided or reconfigured to reduce the count of external openings. Architectural features that weren't quite windows, like perforated grates or skylights, became subjects of legal disputes as homeowners and tax assessors argued over whether they qualified. The tax was designed to be progressive, but it often functioned regressively, especially in urban areas. In rural settings, where the poor lived in small cottages with few windows, the tax did spare them. But in cities, where working-class families lived in large tenement buildings divided into many small units, the entire structure might be considered one house for tax purposes. The landlord, who owned the building, paid the tax based on the total number of windows, then passed the cost on to tenants through rent. The result was that poor urban residents often paid indirectly for windows they couldn't even access, while living in conditions made worse by landlords sealing up openings to save money. There were also cases of overzealous interpretation. Some tax assessors counted tiny openings, like ventilation grates or peepholes, as full windows. Larders with perforated metal screens for airflow were taxed as though they had large glazed windows. This led to legal challenges and public outrage, further eroding support for the tax. The aesthetic impact was significant. Georgian and Victorian architecture, known for its elegance and proportion, was shaped in part by the window tax. Builders had to balance design ideals with tax realities, leading to innovations and compromises. Some buildings have blind windows, decorative false windows built into the facade to maintain symmetry without adding taxable openings. These weren't always tax evasion. Sometimes they were genuine aesthetic choices, but the tax made them more common. When the tax was finally repealed, there was widespread celebration. Newspapers cheered the end of a tax that had darkened homes and endangered health. Architects and builders looked forward to designing with more freedom. And gradually, over the following decades, some bricked-up windows were reopened as homeowners took advantage of the newfound freedom. But many remained sealed. The cost and effort of restoration meant that countless windows stayed bricked, becoming permanent features of the buildings. Today, they serve as historical markers, visible reminders of a policy that seemed reasonable on paper but created real suffering and absurdity in practice. They're a testament to unintended consequences, to the ways laws shape behavior, and to the stubbornness of people confronted with what they perceive as unjust demands. The window tax also offers a lesson in how we think about taxation and fairness. The idea of taxing wealth indirectly, through proxies like windows, seems clever. It avoids the intrusiveness of income assessment and uses something visible and countable. But it relies on assumptions that don't always hold. It assumes that window count correlates reliably with wealth, that people won't change their behavior to avoid the tax, and that the social costs of enforcement and evasion are acceptable. In reality, people adapted. They bricked up windows, built with fewer openings, and found ways around the rules. The tax generated revenue, yes, but it also created inefficiency, hardship, and a built environment that was demonstrably worse for health. It's a case study in how even well-intentioned policies can backfire when they ignore human nature and fail to account for broader impacts. Today, you can still see the legacy. Walk through historic districts and you'll spot them. Sometimes they're pointed out on guided tours, these ghostly outlines of windows that never were or are no more. Sometimes they're just part of the scenery, so common that locals don't even notice them anymore. But they are there, silent witnesses to a time when daylight had a price, and people chose darkness over dead. And perhaps that's the real story of the window tax. Not just a strange historical footnote, but a reminder that laws shape lives in ways both seen and unseen, that people respond to incentives in surprising ways, and that something as simple as a window can become, under the right circumstances, a battleground of power, resistance, and survival. Conclusion. So here we are, at the end of 3 stories. One about beer that wasn't quite what we thought. One about water that wasn't feared at all. And one about windows that were sealed against sunlight to avoid a tax that seemed logical until it wasn't. These myths and misunderstandings, whether medieval or later, share something in common. They all simplify the past into something stranger, dirtier, or more absurd than it actually was. They flatten complex human behavior into easy narratives. They make history feel distant, foreign, like something that happened to people fundamentally different from us. But the truth, when you dig into it, reveals something else. It reveals people making rational choices with the information and resources they had. It reveals communities protecting water sources, building bathhouses, and resisting unjust taxes. It reveals a past that was messy and complicated, yes, but also familiar. People wanted clean water. They valued cleanliness. They resented unfair taxation. They adapted, resisted, and survived. Understanding these stories matters because they shape how we see ourselves. If we believe the medieval period was a time of ignorance and filth, we feel superior. We pat ourselves on the back for living in an age of running water and public health. But if we recognize that people back then were intelligent, resourceful, and capable of organizing complex societies, we see continuity instead of rupture. We see that the challenges they faced, access to clean resources, balancing public health with economic pressures, Navigating unjust laws are challenges we still face today. The beer breakfast myth persists because it's memorable. The fear of water myth persists because it confirms our biases. The window tax story endures because it's almost too strange to believe. But all three, when examined closely, reveal not just facts but values. What we choose to believe about the past says something about what we value in the present. So the next time you hear a story about medieval life that sounds outrageous, pause. Ask yourself what evidence supports it. Ask who benefits from the narrative. Ask whether it might be more myth than truth, more caricature than reality. And remember that the people who lived back then, whether in the 1200s or the 1700s, were no less intelligent, no less capable, and no less deserving of respect than we are. They drank water when it was clean. They bathed when they could. They bricked up their windows not out of madness, but out of practicality. They lived lives constrained by circumstance, shaped by law, and guided by the same basic human desires we all share. To be safe, to be healthy, to have enough, and to resist when the world demands too much. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that the past was better or worse, but that it was human, complicated, contradictory, and always more interesting than the stories we tell ourselves would suggest. Now, rest easy. Let the myths drift away, and sleep knowing that somewhere, centuries ago, a child woke up and drank a cup of cool water from a well. A merchant soaked in a bathhouse after a long day, and a homeowner stared at a bricked-up window and cursed the king. They were people, just like us, and their world, for all its strangeness, wasn't so different after all. Good night.